Good evening. My name is Joan DiPiero, and I'm the Community Engagement Specialist at College of DuPage. Thank you for joining us this evening for Long Lines, Mail-in Ballots, and Outcomes. This presentation is provided through the COD Dialogue Over Distance series. I have a few housekeeping notes before we begin. All participants are muted with videos off. Please submit questions in the Q&A box. The participant chat box is also open, but will not be moderated throughout the event. Put your questions in the question and answer box, and I will get to them and then bring them to the panelists at the proper time. Questions will be gathered. If you have anything else that you'd like to say or share, you can also put that in the chat box. We ask that you are respectful when voicing comments and posing questions. This presentation will be recorded and can be found within 72 hours, archived on the Experts at COD website, which is cod.edu/experts. At this time, I would like to introduce tonight's presenters, David Goldberg and Maureen Heffern Ponicki. David Goldberg is a professor of political science at College of DuPage, where he currently teaches courses in American politics, comparative politics, introduction to foreign policy, and world politics. He received his bachelor's degree in political science from UIC, his master's in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and his doctorate in political science from Northern Illinois University. His areas of research and interest include transnational components of democracy in Latin America and the Caribbean, Latin American politics, U.S. foreign policy, and international relations theory. Maureen Heffern Ponicki is assistant professor of political science at College of DuPage. She has an MA from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where she focused on international economics and development. She is currently writing her dissertation in order to complete her PhD in political science, focused on comparative and urban politics at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Prior to teaching, Maureen worked in the nonprofit sector for many years, both as the grassroots and at the policy level. Now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Goldberg to kick off tonight's discussion. David?
Hi, good evening. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Joan, for the invitation and for the great work that your office does. And Amy as well, go Huskies indeed. So I think in the political science department, appreciate this opportunity to talk about the recent elections and also to talk about what we think this means, not in the form of prognostication, because I don't think that we as political scientists are in the business of predicting outcomes and picking winners, but we can talk a little bit about what happened and our thoughts on those things. So I'm going to share my screen right here and show you my very cluttered desktop, as well as my PowerPoint. Everyone can see this okay, I hope. So thanks to Joan for coming up with the title, because I am very uncreative and would not have come up with anything nearly as creative as this title. So thank you for doing that. So I want to talk a little bit about process, and then Maureen's going to talk about outcomes. And then I think we're going to talk about democracy and kind of what's going forward and what we think these things mean or don't mean. So I'm going to start off by talking about the electoral process, which is pretty complicated in the United States. I mean, I think when I teach this and talk about other countries and the systems that they use, the system that people grow up in this country is remarkably complex and remarkably poorly understood, I think. In Costa Rica, there's a branch of government that does nothing but oversee the elections. So I don't know that that would be a good fit for us. I'm not advocating that it is. But I think the idea that basically counties are responsible for overseeing and administering this very fine-grained, minute process of administering the process and counting the ballots and then reporting back to the states is fascinating. And it's also fascinating that by and large, overall, it works pretty well. For the majority of our nation's history, we have managed to avoid any serious, with a few minor exceptions, major exceptions, avoid irregularities and vote fraud and some of the issues that are prevalent in other countries' elections. So when you register to vote, you register at the county level, and it's the county that's responsible for administering that election process. The federal government has actually very little to do with what happens on election day. So I would say, it's sort of what happened 2 weeks ago was fairly smooth, all things considered, right? The evidence that we have right now, the metrics, the measures that we would use to measure these things in this country across time and in other countries, I would say that this was a fairly smooth election, that there were relatively few irregularities. One of the things that happened in 2016 and that we've seen an increase in is sort of significant influence by, according to the US intelligence community, we hear about Russia, about Iran, about China, to a certain extent North Korea. Haven't heard much about that. The little that there has been from elements in the federal government, Homeland Security in particular, I said this was a remarkably well-run and efficient election that didn't seem to have as much of that, maybe in terms of social media, as what we saw last time. Not so much vote fraud, but more like an attempt to try to influence the outcome, usually using social media, which most people have sort of internalized and come to sort of understand this and deal with it. In addition to that, I think that there's relatively limited evidence of systematic irregularities or vote fraud. So if you look at the sort of the research in political science, there's a fair amount of evidence that suggests overall vote fraud and irregularities, especially systematic, not one person or three people who either by design or oversight violate election laws or seek to undermine what's going on. But in a systematic sense, we don't have very much of that in this country, and we have not had very much of that. Our system, thankfully, historically, has been remarkably free from the kind of vote fraud, irregularity that we've seen in many other countries. There are exceptions to that. One might insert jokes about Chicago or the 1960 presidential elections for comedic relief, but in general, I think our elections have been devoid of that by and large. So one of the components of the title was about long lines. And so let me show you some websites here in a second to support the assertions that I'm making here. But one of the things is that voter turnout was up nationally. And I think that that's a really good thing. So my final bullet point there on this slide is that democracy is a participation sport, right? I think it was designed, our system, our constitution, our electoral laws, the whole thing was designed not to be self-correcting by the people in power, but it was designed that citizens would hold government accountable and that they would express their support or opposition to policies and actors in the system through the voting process. So if we have an estimate that roughly, and you can see hopefully the links that I'm getting these numbers from, are on the bottom of the PowerPoint slide. And either you'll see that because it's going to be recorded, it is recorded as Joan mentioned, or if we can make these slides available, you can see the sites that we're using to sort of indicate where that information came from. So one of the websites that I was looking at, excuse me while I jump around ever so slightly here, is this is the one that I'm looking for. So this is out of the University of Florida, and these are pretty reliable numbers. I was taking a second look. About 60%, which is pretty updated. So as a reliable source from political scientists who's looking at this information. So that's 66% of the voting eligible population, as opposed to everyone that's just over the age of 18, people that, because of felony convictions or restrictions, might not be able to vote. So you can go state by state and see what that looks like. But in general, this is an election that has, by most accounts, what we're seeing right now is it has been about 100 years since we've seen numbers that were this high. And in fairness, I think if you look at the election turnouts and what the party system was like 100 years ago, people were voting not because they were necessarily motivated by like candidates and policies. A lot of it had to do with patronage, and like literally your job and your well-being was determined by whether or not your candidate won office. So voter turnout was much, much higher in the early 20th century and late 19th century, but not for the reasons that we would necessarily like, I would say. So very high voter turnout compared to 12 and 16, but also in terms of 2008, which was pretty high comparatively speaking. Another number here that I think is worth mentioning is that younger voters increased their voter turnout from 53% to 51%, which is what it was in 2008. So the fact that younger people are more motivated to participate in the process, I think, is an excellent indicator of the strength of the system. But also, I would say it's structural, right? I know that in Illinois, seniors in high school could register to vote for the primary if they were going to be 18 at the time of the primary. So if we think about early voting in DuPage County, all those factors increase the likelihood, make it easier for people that can vote, is all, I think, a good thing in general. So let me show you another website here that shows comparisons by states between 2016 and 2020 in terms of who won in 2016, who won in 2020, and what we might make of that, right? So if we look at the states in particular, again, my internet's a little load here, this pages, but we can survey on. Here you can see for all 50 states, how that state voted in 2016 on the left, and then how they voted on the right, and then voter turnout. So you can see a number of states where like voter turnout went up, either a little bit, like Georgia, for example, or Hawaii, where it went up more significantly. And I don't know enough about Alaskan politics actually to explain why there's this 27% drop in voter turnout based on estimates. So that's very interesting. And so I think that's where I find this fascinating, that there's this huge variety across the states, and then thinking about what accounts for that. We know that people were really motivated on both sides, right? I think that's reflected by that huge number in terms of voter turnout. That supporters of both candidates and parties were very much activated to participate in the process, and we see that in general. So you can see that went up a little bit in Minnesota. Illinois went down by about 6 or 7%. And Maryland went down, Massachusetts as well. So you can see the red state indicating that it went for President Trump in 2016 and then in 2020, and then the blue states for Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden. So I think that's useful to sort of dig down a little bit and look at those numbers at the state level. And then again, trying to figure out why is it that some states might have significant declines or increases or just remain the same, as you can kind of see in a place like Texas. So we'd also need to drill down and look at who's voting more. Beyond younger people, would it be Latinx voters? Would it be younger voters, older voters, suburban women? You know, some of the demographics that we've heard a lot about. How are they participating in greater numbers? That doesn't necessarily show up in this data, but it does account for some of that variation here. So I would say again that I think our system is designed to have a lot of participation, and that's a good thing, that more people are paying attention and are engaged in politics. So let me talk just for a second about the Electoral College, which is extremely perplexing, right? Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution outlines the process. And it's pretty much up to the states to decide how they're going to allocate Electoral College votes, which sometimes leads to some interesting conspiracy theories or other ways of looking at things, right? So the simplest way to think about this is that we don't have direct election of the presidency in the United States. This is the website that I'm looking for that's on the bottom of that slide. We have the indirect election of the president, where voters choose usually members of the Electoral College who then vote on behalf of citizens. Not entirely unlike for 100 years, the US Senate was indirectly elected by voters. It was chosen by state legislatures. And so I think there's a couple of reasons why we have the conventional wisdom about why we have the Electoral College. One explanation is that it would give smaller states a voice. Another explanation is that would help prevent the election of an extremist candidate. I also think that it's worth noting that the founders who designed the system were a little bit ambivalent about what they would have referred to as too much democracy. They didn't associate democracy necessarily with the things that we associate democracy with. That's why the word does not appear in the Constitution. So they would have been worried that citizens who didn't own property, were not necessarily literate or certainly well-versed in the canon of Western political philosophy, would have been easily swayed by smooth-talking snake oil salesmen, right? And so I think those are all part of the explanation for why the Electoral College was put into place in the first place. So it has functioned by and large. We have 1888 and then 2000, where there's a split between the Electoral College and the popular vote, and then that happens again in 2016. So what you can see on this map here, and this is an easy page to remember, 270 to win, because that's how many Electoral College votes you needed to win the Electoral College to become elected president. So you can see, for example, Illinois has 20 Electoral College votes, which is 18 for our House seats and 2 for Senate seats. So that's 2 seats are the constant. That's going to be the same for every state. And the 18 is going to change every 10 years based on census data. So if you peruse this website a little bit more, you'll see that Illinois' share of the Electoral College vote has been declining over time as our population has declined. While we have not seen any new states in quite some time in the United States, those state seats, that we're losing are shifting down here to the southeast and the southwest. So Florida, Texas, California continue to gain in terms of their Electoral College representation. And you can see these huge numbers, that if you need 270 Electoral College votes to win, that you can add up, if you're a Republican candidate, the reliably red states, and do the same if you are the Democratic candidate. And really what that leads to is that there's really only about 10 to 12 states that are in play, right? That are sometimes called swing states. So Illinois in general is a reliably blue state. Texas is a reliably red state, right? And there are a bunch of others that sort of fit into that category. So a lot of states in the Electoral College are not going to get a whole bunch of attention from a political campaign because they're not really in play, right? If you're the Trump campaign, you're not going to spend a ton of money advertising in Chicago the week before this. And if you're the Biden campaign, you're not going to spend a ton of time advertising in parts of Texas for the very same reasons. You're not competitive there. Your candidate is not competitive there. So those are the reasons why we have the Electoral College process. But I think, and here I'm going to kind of put my opinion as opposed to just objective analysis. I think our electoral process is in need of a revamp, right? There are many parts of the Constitution that have aged remarkably well and continue to be a model for other countries when they think about designing a Constitution and the system of government that we have. That doesn't mean that it is beyond reproach. It doesn't mean that occasionally it couldn't use a tune-up. And I think the Electoral College is one such example of a potential tune-up. And I say that, I think objectively, that that's not a partisan statement. As I'll show you in a second, there are a lot of state legislatures that are looking at one area of reform that I'll talk about here in a second that are bipartisan or nonpartisan, right? That this is a system that doesn't necessarily, the reform proposals, help or hurt on the whole everybody, right? In the wash over several presidential election cycles, it would be equal. So hopefully you can see here, most countries use direct election of the executive branch. So most countries either have a majority runoff system, and I'll talk about in a second, if they have a presidential system, or some other method where citizens are directly choosing the president, unlike what we have. So perhaps you've heard of this majority runoff system because that's what's going to be used to determine the 2 Senate seats that are up for grabs in Georgia. That's how Louisiana chooses its senators. That's how the city of Chicago chooses the mayor. It's a 2-round system that basically says all the candidates that are running run in the first round. And if somebody gets a simple majority, 50% plus 1, then they win. They are the mayor, they are the senator, they are the president, they are the premier. But in many cases, if you have a whole bunch of candidates running, the person that gets a plurality, more votes than anyone else, isn't necessarily going to get a majority. So that's the second round of the runoff system in Georgia and these other places that I'm mentioning. the top 2 vote getters move on to a second round. Now that's a really efficient system, because what happens is the candidate that emerges victorious from that second round is going to have probably a pretty large margin of victory. They're going to be able to say, I have a mandate from the voters. I get to implement my policy, my slate. I get to enact my vision of how the government should be run, in a sense, because they're probably going to win by a majority, right? But by definition, if you have 2 candidates in the second round, the chance of the mathematical probability of a tie is pretty low. So that's nice, because it allows those 2 candidates to merge, and then the people that win are going to have a stronger mandate. And so that's one reason why a number of countries in Latin America, in Europe, and many different parts of the world have moved to a majority runoff system to choose the chief executive, in many cases the president. So that's one way to do it. So when I say that I think that our electoral system in the United States is due for a tune-up, I'm talking primarily about the presidential campaign. So I'm not going to talk too much about how we elect members of Congress, or really about primaries, which is also a system that I think is profoundly past its sell-by date, right? It's expired. It is milk that turned into yogurt and doesn't smell good in the fridge, right? It's time to move on. And so one potential way to do that is to have a majority runoff system for members of Congress. You could do that. It would not be very difficult. And I've not shown you any visuals on that, but it's not very difficult to explain. And countries that have much higher rates of illiteracy than we do use that system with great effect, right? So this is not a complicated system that requires advanced ability to deal with math or candidates or policies. This is really straightforward. If you get 50% plus 1, you win. If not, the top 2 vote getters move on. So that's a majority runoff system. Many other countries use a proportional representation system, which is just what it sounds like. Instead of a first past the post or winner take all, which is what our system is, the share of the vote that you get determines how many seats you get in the legislature, which obviously would not work with a 2-party system. So there are other changes that would have to take place on the whole. So if moving away from the legislative congressional issues and saying, if we want to talk about maybe updating the Electoral College, what are our options? Well, the most difficult one and the most obvious is to amend the Constitution. That is really hard to do and involves super majorities of 2/3 and 3/4. And so it's extremely unlikely that you could amend the Constitution for this. Not impossible, but unlikely. But instead, what we have, another process that's moving forward right now, Colorado being the most recent state to enact this, it's called the National Popular Vote. And you can see here, again, a remarkably similar, easy to remember website, nationalpopularvote.com, tells you what this says. This is a way to basically minimize the influence or eliminate the influence of the Electoral College, because what the National Popular Vote says, whatever candidate wins the most popular votes in that state, by state law, gets the Electoral College vote. So there would never be a split between the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. Illinois did this a few years ago. One of our recent felonious governors, you may remember Rod, the haircut Blagojevich, right? It was under the Blagojevich administration that the Illinois legislature passed this into law, because what the Constitution says is each state gets to decide how they're going to do this, how they're going to shuffle that deck for Electoral College votes. So Illinois, along with a whole bunch of other states, the most recent being Colorado, you can see here, with 9 Electoral College votes, have adopted this. So 196 Electoral College votes is not enough to swing it, but it's getting closer, because if you get to 270, then basically the Electoral College doesn't really matter anymore. So this is a very easy to understand. Whoever wins the popular vote gets the Electoral College votes according to state law. That's it. Right? So that's easy to understand. You can see the benefits of it. You can see here, you can look at what states have adopted this. You can see where the legislation is at in each state. And if you go down and dive into this a little bit more, what you see is, again, there are a whole bunch of states, Democratic-controlled state legislatures or Republican-controlled state legislatures, that are all seeing some value in this, right? So this is not necessarily a partisan issue. It's one that minimizes the old issues about from the 18th century, that people weren't literate or they didn't own property or these other basically obstacles to participate in the democratic process that are much, much harder to justify, in my opinion, in 2020 than they were before, and at least opens the possibility of having this conversation about what we might consider for legitimate national popular vote kinds of reforms. And so there are some other links there that I am not going to go into here right now, so that I can turn the floor over in a second. And then maybe at the end, we can talk about sort of going forward and wrapping up the democratic process. Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to mention the Electoral College itself, how that process works. So the first Tuesday in November, we think of as the election. In December, the state members of the Electoral College go to the state capitals, and that's where they cast their ballots. And then in January, the vice president is responsible for reading those into the official record, which makes a lot of sense in the 18th century when that's how communication literally took weeks and months to get from one part of the country to another. So it's this really elongated process that starts in November and ends in January. So while we usually think, even though this one has been a little bit longer than usual, that most people are going to go to bed on election night and know who the next president is. Well, this is a system that takes 2 months to basically figure that out. So the Electoral College, where state parties basically get to pick who's going to represent their interest in the Electoral College, and those people are not members of the House and the Senate. That's prohibited by the Constitution. So it's a convoluted process for sure, and not by accident. Again, I think reflecting what would be some of the ambivalence of the founding fathers about too much democracy and the ability of people to be swayed by what they saw as snake oil salesmen who might not necessarily have the best interests of the country was part of their concern. It would be one way to put it, I guess. So that system that is long and hard to understand and opaque at best, and also in a sense undemocratic, is one that we should at least have the conversation. There was a lot of conversation in 2000 about this. I remember there was bipartisan legislation co-sponsored in the House of Representatives about reforming the Electoral College. And then 9/11 hit a few months later, and suddenly Electoral College reform did not seem nearly as important as other things that were going on in the country. So this is kind of elements of this are kind of dry and don't lend themselves to the kind of emotional, divisive cable news, talk radio discussions that producers require to get eyes and advertisers and ears. This doesn't really lend itself to that, but it's arguably as important or more important than those other divisive issues that people really do fight about. So with that in mind, I will turn it over to Maureen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. That was a terrific overview. And I think I'm just going to start with echoing his point about historic voter turnout. If there's one thing that we can all celebrate here in the United States right now, it is that voter turnout, because a democracy depends on it. And as David said, that it's a participatory sport, and we should be thrilled with that. Granted, it's not nearly as much like in some countries. In Sweden, in their 2018 election, they had an 82.1% turnout, but that's okay. We are thrilled with right now is 64.8 or something, with projections that will get to 66.7. That is just historic, and as David mentioned, the highest rates in 100 years. So we'll start with the good, and then I just want to look at a few of the trends and changes in voting patterns, what we are kind of seeing now. So I kind of look at the blue wall, the issue of the Sun Belt, Latinx vote, and the suburbs. So when we look at the blue wall is that area of the country that was kind of considered solidly Democrat. Yet in 2016, 3 of those states, the Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, broke for Trump. And so everybody was thrown by that. Where did that come from? And I think we haven't yet fully understood we haven't yet fully understood what is going on in the United States, what is fueling the discontent. I would hope that that's really what we'll begin to talk about and not put that in the past. I would argue that one of the reasons the blue wall broke for Trump is that those were states where it was very strong labor, blue collar unions, and a lot of those jobs left decades ago. And there hasn't been an honest effort on behalf by either party to address that. The money to put into retraining, into education has really not come. And so both parties in many ways have let folks who got left behind in our new global economy. So that will probably, I'm hoping that will still be looked at some point. But Biden focused a lot of energy on those 3 states. He spent 3 times as much advertising in Michigan, Wisconsin, and PA as compared to Texas and Arizona, and he won those 3 states back. So I just say that in terms of the advertising money matters, and he was strategic in not putting effort into some of those states that they were hoping would turn, and just went and focused back on that blue wall. But the second trend is this rise of the Sun Belt and these changes we are seeing in Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, Nevada, and Arizona. There's increases in blue and Democratic voting in those areas, but it is not a given. We have been predicting for some time that those states will begin to change simply because of demographic changes in those countries, especially an increase in the Latino population. It has always been assumed to be good for Democrats, but that brings me to the next trend. What we really learned from this election is there is no such thing as the Latino vote. There's a growing Latino population in the United States, and parties need to talk to them as voters, not as one demographic. And both Trump and Biden benefited from their vote. Cuba and Venezuela kind of influenced, or what people are saying is that in Florida, there's a lot of people who have had a not so positive experience of socialism. The Trump campaign used that fear of socialism well and turned some of the Cuban and Venezuelan voters against Biden for fear of socialism, which I say that because it just speaks to the diversity within the Latino population. There is no one Latino. There are Mexicans, there are Puerto Ricans, there are Cubans, Venezuelans, Peruvians, and they don't all, much like any demographic, they don't all vote alike, but they're all growing population. And I think this election really said, in a way, it's asking parties to do what parties are supposed to do, and they're supposed to respond to the voters and not assume that they are with you. And then the last one trend that is interesting is this I would call it a subtle move to the left in the suburbs. It's not overwhelming, but it's significant in that it's there yet again. Younger, more diverse families are settling in the suburbs. What we know about cities overall is that the shape of cities has changed dramatically over the years. No longer is it like a low-income population in the center of the city surrounded by wealthy suburbs. That's a city of yesteryear. One of the urbanists named Richard Florida famously called it the patchwork metropolis because people are moving everywhere. Diversity is everywhere. Income levels are moving everywhere, and our suburbs are not what they used to be. And we're seeing that reflected in the vote. I am going to try to share my screen here. And look at a couple of the, let me see if I have, okay. So, well, actually, hold on. That one I didn't want to show quite yet. Sorry. Let going to show you just the change in the suburb vote here. Here we go. How the suburbs have moved away over time. Okay. There we go. Hopefully you can see that now. This is an interesting graph, but what it's showing is that along this dotted line here, the counties basically above this line and to the right have become more Democratic. The ones below have become more Republican. And so visually, you can really see the counties that shifted and voted for Biden. And these are suburban counties. So overall, you see, you see some counties come shift down, but overall, you see a tremendous shift to the left from suburban voters. And actually, I'm just going to show this one too to echo what David was saying earlier. Here's 64.8% turnout in 2020. You know, the highest ever that we have recorded was 65.7 in 1908. So we're projected to go up to 66.7. So that's really quite remarkable. Okay, so the next thing, so we have these trends. Secondly, we have a polling problem, and that's one of the outcomes. We knew we had a polling problem after the 2016 election, and there was a reckoning for the industry. After the 2016 election, much of the focus was looking at the non-college educated white voter. And what the pollsters thought they did was they just didn't weight their polls enough with enough of those voters, because it's the non-college educated white voter that is leaning heavily for Trump, both in 2016 and in 2020. And after 2016, they realized that they didn't have the polls, they didn't have enough representation of those folks in their polls. So theoretically, they had tried to adjust for that, and yet they still didn't get it. But I think it's important to say, as David mentioned, these are state elections. The national polls actually were fairly accurate, but we don't have a national election. So as citizens, we have to become good consumers of information on many levels. But one of the things, as we're reading those national polls, we can say, oh, that's interesting. That might reflect the popular vote. But yet we know the popular vote doesn't win an election. State polls are notoriously very underfunded. Polling costs a lot of money. And so the state polls did not get it. And many feared that they did not accurately reach those folks like white voters without a college education. There's also other theories that there's something called the shy Trump hypothesis, that those who voted for Trump did not want to admit it. There's also theories about do Trump voters not answer the phone and talk to pollsters as much as Democratic voters? We don't know. This is what the industry will have to begin to look at, how they contact people. We all know ourselves, many of us don't answer the phone as much as we used to. So if polling wants to stay relevant, they're going to have to figure out how to reach people in this day and age. So I think they will be taking a long, hard look at their methods, in summary on that. And then probably most importantly, in terms of outcomes from the election, is that what we know is that we have a deeply divided country. That should be clear as day. And my hope is that is what we focus on, in the sense that we need to work on that divide. And there are many things we can do. But I'm going to go back and just show you those, just kind of a look at some of, these are from Pew Research. But the differences we have. So here in the blue are voters that were leaning Biden and how they felt about the economy versus Trump voters, like what they felt was very important in the presidential election. Healthcare, a bigger difference between Trump and Biden voters. Supreme Court appointments, there's some commonality there. The coronavirus outbreak, very distinct perspective on that. Foreign policy closer, and abortion not as far away as we often think it is. And then I have another one here. About 1 in 5 Trump and Biden supporters say that they share the same core American values and goals. So if you look at this, Trump supporters, 80% or so say, not only do we have different priorities when it comes to politics, but we fundamentally disagree about core American values. 80% of Trump's views of Trump supporters among Biden voters, and 77% views of Biden supporters among Trump voters. Basically, Trump voters and Biden voters don't think we fundamentally agree on core American values. It's not just politics. So that is a worrisome data point, because it speaks to these divisions, which we all know and live in, and it's palpable. So as far as kind of how do you go forward, first of all, we have to hope that the American institutions hold up to this unique challenge right now. And we have always had a peaceful transfer of power. I expect that we will again, but it will be a true test of our institutions. And the hope is that President Trump will soon concede, and we, will continue on, and the American institutions are strong enough to deal with this hopeful blip. Secondly, we've got to build from points of agreement. And I think that all of us as citizens now have to begin to talk about that. We can talk till we're blue in the face about what we disagree about. Why don't we start talking about what we agree and find those points of agreement and listen to one another? And I'm not saying this like I have the answer to how we do that, because it's incredibly challenging. But as many of us know, we see students do this time and time again in classrooms, that there is this real ability to find points of agreement. And I think we do need to rebuild the trust in our electoral system. As many have said, the accusations of widespread fraud are not, we don't, as political scientists, we don't worry about that because of this particular election. We worry about that because losing trust can hurt democracy over the long term. And it's one thing to lose trust when there's evidence that something is not going well. But when there is no evidence of that, to lose trust is a dangerous thing. You might, I don't know if you had all seen, but I'll just give this one example, that Trump's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency released a report saying that, quote, the election was the most secure in American history. Just before we went on to this webinar, Trump fired the head of that agency. And I'm not saying this to be partisan. That is not my intent whatsoever. My intent is to say that we have to be wise about sorting through information. And so that was my last kind of point, is how do we, as a community of education here, how do we, as a broader communities, begin to work towards teaching one another how to ascertain truth from fiction. And obviously we all know, or should know by now, that we should never get our news from social media. And we'll say that 100 million times again, do not get your news from social media. But beyond that, we do have to, the responsibility falls on us, as all responsibility does in a democracy. It falls on us to be judicious about what we read, what we share, checking our sources. And I don't see a way forward unless we are really, we begin to really talk about that as a community together. I think, then lastly, I guess I would say I would echo of some of what David has said about proposals for change. There are so many. I would echo that the best way forward is exactly what he said in terms of the National Popular Vote Compact. And the idea is that most of the states like Illinois sign on but we won't do it until a certain percentage of all the states agree to do it. Because in a blue dominated state, we don't want to yet give up and divide those electoral votes until we can be sure that everybody is doing it. And I think it is a beautiful way to circumvent the outdated institution that is the Electoral College and avoid a very, not impossible, but very, very messy way to actually amend the Constitution. That just, as he said, just doesn't seem feasible. And then there's a whole list of other things which we won't go into. We're going to leave time for questions, but ideas about ranked choice voting, proportional representation, participatory budgeting, deliberative democracy, citizen redistricting to undercut some of the gerrymandering, public financing of campaigns, and civic education. So there's so many things we can do. I guess I would end on that. There are so many things that we can do to keep this democracy strong, but I do think it resides in all of us. So I guess I'll end on that point, and I think we're going to turn it to questions, correct?
Thank you. Yes, we are going to take some questions now. This was very, entertaining, and B, as the dust settled, it's nice to be able to go back and say, hey, look, election day was a week long. We finally got information. So now it's time to really sit back and talk about it. I do have my first question. Regarding the election process, what are you hearing from students about their take on the election process, since many of them are newly able to vote? Are they just excited to vote, or do they find it to be an archaic system? Anyone?
Well, I'll just take the one thing that I think is fascinating and is so encouraging is the Gen Z generation is very politically active. So we've got young people. My experience in the classroom is that there's a real hopeful attitude for the future. So I haven't heard much emphasis on kind of the antiquated part of it, but hope for, yeah, we'll change it. We can do this. My only worry is what the degree to which people still depend on social media for their news, which feeds them inaccurate information. And I don't think that's going away anytime soon. And so I would say that's the discouraging news for the future. I don't know, David, what you'd say.
Yeah, I mean, I think I echo what Maureen's saying about students that are engaged politically, but maybe not in the traditional sense, right? And I think that's part of what is contributing to both the rise of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders and AOC and other voices that are kind of outside of the control of the two-party system in a sense, even though they're both inside the parties. I think that students are issue-based, right? They're concerned about particular issues, but they're also a level of cynicism that definitely concerns me, right? Because that's not a good thing, but I think students being involved and engaged is a good thing, regardless of whatever their issues are, whoever they're supporting is secondary to the fact that they, at an early age, that they want to participate. Because we know in political science that if you're participating early in your life, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to be a regular voter and an active participant in the political process for the remainder of your life. So if you get sort of like inoculated at 18, then there's a good chance as your life moves forward in the trajectory of it that you'll continue to be an active participant in the process. So I think those are good positive signs for political participation, but they also suggest that there's dissatisfaction with the two-party system, with the Electoral College, and with the way that I would argue elites in both parties address issues, and the way that the structure pushes things. The focus is not one that speaks to a lot of citizens, let alone young people.
Thank you. Second question is, and I was thinking about this as well, what are the chances of a ranked choice voting system in the near future?
Go ahead, Maureen.
Well, I always tell students, if you want to change something, start at the local level. And there's your easiest way to begin to change things. In many ways, some people say ranked choice voting, which I think is a real fabulous way of voting. And for those of you who haven't heard about it, you would rank the idea is to get rid of this idea of a wasted vote. So say you wanted to vote for the Libertarian or the Green Party, and that's where your heart lies. And so you want to do that, even though you know there's no way they're going to get a majority. And in our most of our voting systems are winner take all, meaning whoever gets the majority takes all of the votes. So you rank them. And then if your first, say it's the Libertarian or the Green candidate, doesn't get enough votes, then the computer system will pull your second vote and your second vote gets counted. So you're never wasting your vote, and it allows more people to begin to put their votes where they want them. And so I think it's a great idea. And I think the easiest way to begin to do it is start at the local level so that people get accustomed to voting this way. And then you can change things at the state level and upwards.
Yeah, I mean, totally agree. And I just pulled up this website, fairvote.org, that goes into this in more detail. So I mentioned proportional representation and majority runoff. Ranked or preference voting is something that is used in many different places around the world. It's really easy, as Maureen just explained. It allows people to have more of a say in how the process works, instead of your first or second candidate didn't make it, and so you're left holding your nose for a candidate that is your third, fourth, or fifth choice. This is a way to incorporate that into the process. So check out fairvote.org. And these are just a couple of the electoral system reforms that I think are possible, and things that that would restore some of the trust that Maureen was referencing in terms of the process and the system, that wouldn't be perceived as gamed necessarily by partisanship.
Building on that, our next question is, what would it take to add voices to the political process with 3 or maybe 4 parties? Why stick with only 2 parties? When we first started the United States, we had a lot more parties.
Yeah. Well, so the answer is always, we have no rule that it has to be 2 parties. The problem is the winner take all electoral system, how we count our votes. And we can change that, especially at the local and the state level. Those, again, are the easiest places to begin to change it. You change that, and then it's there's more incentive for a third party to get in the game, because if you counted your votes proportionally, like David mentioned, proportional representation, if the Greens get 10%, well, they get 10% of the seats. If the Libertarians get 15%, they get 15% of the seats. And you have an incentive for, if you wanted to change something through the political system, there's an incentive to form a party and do that. Right now, there's no incentive to make change through a political party because of the winner take all electoral vote counting. David, were you going to add on to that?
Yeah, so I would just say what I said at the beginning, the process about it being controlled by the states. So we have a 2-party system, right? Like there's one of 2 explanations. One is because that's what voters want, because they're big tent parties, right, that reflect the fact that there's a lot of different opinions that don't easily fall into ideological spectrums in the way that they do in some other countries. So is it a 2-party system because that's what voters want, or is it a 2-party system because at the state level, to change electoral laws, it's very difficult if you're not one of those 2 parties, right? So they're invested in the status quo. That doesn't mean that it's beyond reproach or can't be fixed. But what Maureen's saying about you start at the bottom and not at the top. I mean, we sort of, see ads and there's a push that just emphasizes federal elections, but a lot of the real change takes place at the local level. And it's state parties and state capitals that control how easy or difficult it is for these other parties to get on the ballot, right? It can be very easy. It can be a small check, or it can be getting a significant percentage of the people that voted in the last election, which in a state like California, Texas, Illinois, or Florida is a hell of a lot of people. So the obstacles or absence of obstacles are not by accident. They're the result of political preferences by people that are in power.
Going back to what Maureen had said about the importance of trusting the system, our next question is, so far, President Trump, the Trump campaign, and the GOP have been unsuccessful in their baseless efforts to delegitimize the election, going 1-24 in court so far. However, many supporters of President Trump and the GOP now believe that the democratic process is illegitimate and untrustworthy. How concerned are you for the future of our democratic process and the institutions when a large portion of the country is now uncertain about our electoral process?
You want me to take?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely concerned. I think, go ahead.
No, go.
Maureen, go ahead.
You.
There's a lag on my internet. I apologize. There's like a 5-second delay. So I would say that the country's divided for sure, and we can't overestimate the significance of that, because I think it is more divided than it's been during most of our lifetimes, and maybe harkening back to '68 or earlier periods of time. I think that's all true. I think at a deeper sense, we need to do a better job of trying to understand the circumstances that gave rise to the political moment that we're in, right? That I don't think that President Trump and candidate Trump and Bernie Sanders and these other candidates that are outside of the mainstream could have existed in the same way a few decades ago, right? They're responding to dissatisfaction with the political status quo, with the two-party system, with infrastructure, with institutions that no longer meet the needs of a lot of people. So as long as that's the case, as long as the structure and the institutions do not reflect the interests and the desire of a lot of people, then you're going to continue to have discontent. So that's a sort of a bigger response to that. I think in the short term, I'll be interested to see sort of how the GOP moves on and responds, right? I think both parties are in the midst of a political identity crisis, right? So the Democratic Party is not the New Deal Democratic Party of Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson. It's not really the party of Bill and sort of Southern Democrats. It's kind of unclear exactly where the Democratic Party is. And definitely the case for the Republican Party as well, because Trump's Republican Party is not the party of Ronald Reagan and Goldwater and these sort of smaller government, other perspectives, right? So how those people move forward, right? How the Senate and the House and the Republican National Committee and others move forward in finding a role for President Trump as a kingmaker, as some have suggested, or not, if he chooses to do something else as a private citizen, will be very, very interesting. But my concern is, and I wanted to put this in a more global context, that a lot of these things are really personality driven. So there may be ideas or policies that Trump represents that are attractive to the 70 million people that voted for him. The question is there another leader within the Republican Party that can sort of put that into practice? And I think that's where the problem is. That if it becomes excessively personalized, then our politics are a problem, right? When it just becomes the personality, the charismatic leader, and not institutions and structure, then we have a real problem. So I want to see where the Republican Party is going to pivot in a post-Trump environment, and also where the Democratic Party is going to go, because if nothing else, we know we have two white men in their 70s, and there's a very good chance this will be the last presidential election where we can say that in the same way. So we're on the precipice of something changing in our American politics and in our global politics. It's not clear where we're going. It's clear there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the past.
And I would just add one thing that before the election, I remember somebody had asked, it was when Trump wouldn't say that he could guarantee that he would concede if he lost. And somebody said, well, are we going to find ourselves in a dangerous position if this happens? And I remember that they were saying there's two institutions that could really help with this. One is the media and the other is the Republican Party. I would say the media has done a fairly good job at backing up the integrity of the election system. The Republican Party has not. And the interesting thing about it is, again, the lesson with democracy is that it's always the people. We drive it. And in this case, the argument is that it's those 70 million folks are driving and pushing and that the Republican elected leaders do not want to alienate that base, and they don't want to make Trump mad, because they will then not get reelected, and every politician wants to get reelected, and so they're afraid to stand up for the integrity of our election system because they want to get reelected. So in essence, they're afraid of us. And so therefore it comes back to, once again, as it should in a democracy, it comes back to people to become informed about, was there fraud or was there not? And there's no easy fix to that, except that we have to begin, I guess a serious call for civic education. But in the short term, we do have a problem of literacy. And there's always been talk about that in a democracy. A democracy does not function well if in literacy, I mean ability, information literacy. We, in an information loaded society, need to be able to discern what is fact and what is fiction. And so in a way, yes, the Republican Party, I think, is failing in this instance, but in many ways, it's on us.
Well, following up with that and how the Republicans are feeling, if President Trump fails to concede, if he doesn't want to move out of the White House, what happens next, and what does that do to an already divided country?
I don't even want to think about it.
If the states certify the elections, then you have 270 Electoral College votes given to Joe Biden, then he wins the presidency. I don't think there's actually sometimes it's hard to separate out norms of behavior, like informal practices, from rules and structure in the law. I don't think that there's actually any, and I could be wrong about this, please, Maureen, jump in. I don't think that there's actually any kind of legal or constitutional requirement that the president concede the election, that he has a press conference where he says, nice job, thank you, I'll see you later. There's no requirement of that. I mean, I think legally, this is not as close of an election as, say, 1960, right? There were other elections that really, really did go down to the wire in a different way. If you look at the numbers right now in the states, this is not that election. So I think under different circumstances, if some of the allegations that were coming out of the White House had a modicum of basis in reality, then maybe we'd be talking about that situation. But I don't see a serious scenario right now where we're talking about a situation where this is relevant. I mean, it's even less relevant today, right, than it was a week ago, when we were still talking and closely watching what was going on in certain counties in Georgia and Arizona and what was going to happen in Michigan. Even less so. So a week from now, there'll be less of that, right? There's sort of an inertia that takes on its own momentum here, I think.
Maureen, do you want to discuss, or should we move on to the next?
Go ahead and move on.
I think David had touched on this earlier. Might there be this might be a more historical question, but has the country ever experienced a higher level of division than current times, other than the Civil War? Anybody?
Well, I think we have been very divided across history. There's always, it's hard to tell, are we more polarized than we were? But I don't have any doubts that the polarization, we will get through that. I mean, our system was created to compel compromise. And I think we will end up figuring that out, and we have across time. Yes, post-Civil War, I think it was actually one of the elections, and there wasn't a clear winner, and they did some negotiating, and they did some compromising and some deal trading, and everything went on. So I think many politicians would say this is one of the most polarized times, and partisanship, the word hyper-partisanship is alive and well now. But it would be great actually to, every time I've heard some historians look at this over the long term, we have gotten through other times where it's been very divided. I don't know which one's more divided. I don't know if, David, you want to weigh in on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, what jumped to mind in relatively recent memory would have been 1968. When you think about the Vietnam War and dissent in the streets and the civil rights movement and a lot of other things, I'm not even sure that I agree with the hyper-partisanship thing. I think that what social media and high-speed internet and cable do is enable us and everything else in that vein, allow us to sort of get into an echo chamber where we're talking at each other and past each other and patting ourselves on the back for our, how great it is to be right when you're confirmed by the people you agree with. I think there's a lot of that, and it sort of makes it seem brighter and louder than perhaps it might be. I think, to my point about what the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are facing in the future, is that if you asked people that were excited about this election, can you tell me 3 policy differences between Trump and Biden, that most people would have a hard time with that. So much of this is like visceral, right? And maybe people could talk about ICE, or they could talk about Social Security reform or Medicare for all or student loans. There might be these issues. But in general, I'm not sure that this is polarization in that way, right? In the same way that it was when you look at the realignments of the past in American politics. I'm not sure that this is a realignment, that this is gonna propel the Republicans to a massive sweep in the midterm election, or that this is going to propel the Democrats to take control of the Senate in 22. I'm not sure that it's gonna work that way. I think people are polarized in their views about issues, but not necessarily in terms of partisanship. And so I do think that there are times in the past, besides the Civil War, which is an easy thing to point to say that we've been very divided, and we have been very divided. But I also think there was relatively little unrest, right? And there's no reason to have that either. But I would say that there have been times in the past where the country's been deeply divided along partisan and ideological lines that are probably equal to, if not greater than this, that did not start and end in 1865.
I'll just add one more point. I was remembering, I heard a talk by 2 authors, Suzanne Mettler and Robert Lieberman, who wrote a book looking at these different historical periods of kind of crisis in the US. And their argument is that we are in a unique situation where they find 4 of the variables that they identify as kind of putting us in a dangerous position. And in every other crisis, at least one of these variables were present. This is the only time when all 4 of the variables are present. And the variables are political polarization, conflict over who belongs in a political community, increased economic inequality, and excessive executive power. And having those 4 things present at once puts us in a weak position as a country. I don't feel a lack of hope about it, but I think we should have our eyes open that the inequality, watching the power we give to the executive, being careful about who we define, and being careful with that, labeling people as others in the in-group and the out-group, and finding common ground in politics is a mandate for all of us.
Thank you. Here's a technical question. As a good poli-sci person, if the unthinkable happens and a president isn't verified by the Congress or VP by Inauguration Day, is it true that a vacancy in the executive would result in the Speaker of the House becoming president?
I'm not sure that I'm following the line that got us to President Pelosi. If you know what I mean? I don't know if you. I'm not sure that I follow how both the presidency and the vacancy are vacated. Then yes, the Speaker of the House is next in line constitutionally. That's not a question. If there was a tie in the Electoral College, then it would fall to the House of Representatives to vote on that. But that, I'm not sure that that's the question. Did you understand that differently, Maureen?
I think that the question is, if all these steps for some reason don't happen, which I think that probably is too much of a step, or too much of a assumption that those won't happen. The vote will get certified. Who it goes for, but the states will certify at every single state level. And I'll just point, I know the New York Times called 49 out of the 50 states. They called their Secretary of States, the folks responsible for the elections. They reached 49 out of the 50. All 49, both Republicans and Democrats, said there was no indication of fraud, widespread fraud. Again, here, there, one or two cases, that will happen, but no widespread fraud. So it would be taking a lot of steps to say each of those states then don't certify, then it doesn't go to Congress, and that the President-elect Biden doesn't get inaugurated. But I don't expect that.
Okay. We have a clarification. If let's say the Electoral College results have been verified, but if there is a vacancy on January 20th due to not being verified, would Pelosi be president?
I just don't think that happens.
Those are incompatible. Those are mutually exclusive things. Yeah.
Okay. As a political scientist, both of you, on a scale of 1 to 10, how exciting has this election cycle been to observe and study? I mean, hey, sometimes it's not fun, but this has got to be good. Or is it a better scale 1 to 10 for how exhausting it's been?
Definitely a 10.
Both
I don't
ways.
know what you'd say, David.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was fun, and it was fun right up till the end. It's also exhausting, and I'm glad to not have to watch cable news with such regularity anymore, and I'm glad to not have to participate in that in the same way. I mean, I think I'm interested in the fact that there's this sort of populist nationalist wave around the world, and that this is a part of that. And so I wonder if does Trump's defeat signal a high watermark for this resurgence of nationalism and populism? That's, I think, an ongoing question. So I don't think it ended on November 3rd. I think we have to wait and see, like Brexit, and then in a bunch of countries like Brazil and the Philippines and Russia and Hungary, where there are sort of similar political currents taking place. So to me, that's really intellectually stimulating and not something as draining as, watching high production values on cable television, call in counties and do all that. That sort of horse race aspect, I do find exhausting at some point. It ceases to be of interest to me. And beyond, obviously want to know who wins the election, but that in and of itself becomes tiresome quick. I'm interested in the underlying currents about why these things are occurring. Why are people responding the way they are? And I think we both alluded to the fact that it's because of deeper seated issues that are not being addressed by the status quo. And as long as that's the case, we're still going to be talking about these issues that I do find to be rewarding and intellectually very stimulating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. And, I think back, like 20 years ago, I was working in for a nonprofit that worked on global trade issues and globalization issues. And, the writing on the wall was there then, that as we globalize, it has to be done in a way that is fair, that all the gains don't go to certain groups and we don't leave too many behind. And, that wasn't done. My dissertation research is on Buffalo, New York. And, it's a city that deindustrialized, almost 50 years ago, and it still has a 30% poverty rate. Those are the type of cities that are of people who are discontent because things aren't looking so good, and it's not easy to find a job, and it has been hard to retool and get educated. So I agree with David, the interest in and also what Keith says is that this isn't unique to us. So it should tell us to look deeper. What's going on at a global level? That why is this rise, the same phenomena happening in other countries as it is here? And so, yeah, we just should be really looking at the root causes.
Okay, our upcoming dialogue over distance will continue. This Friday, November 20th, we'll have a special event called How We Give, and we're talking about why we give during this time of year and why volunteering and donations are so important. That's part of the COD Cares Up to No Good campaign. November 23rd will be Defining Systemic Racism, presented by the COD Speakers Bureau, hosted by Lincolnwood Public Library. And you could go to Lincolnwood Public Library, lincolnwoodlibrary.org to sign up. These are all free events. December 15th, we will round out our discussion about political topics by talking about coattails and chasms, the local impact of the national elections. What is this going to mean for the county of DuPage and what we're going to see happening here? I'd like to thank our panelists, Professor Goldberg and Professor Heffern Ponicki. This has been, again, quite entertaining, very informative, really exciting. I'm sure you guys have had an exciting time as well. Thank you for coming and joining us during this discussion. If you'd like to learn more about the American election process and political science in general, please visit our website, cod.edu, and search political science. We have tons of information out there. Grab a class, get into credit classes or non-credit classes, and take some time during COVID lockdown to learn a little bit more. Dialogue Over Distance will continue, like I said, so please join us next time. You can also visit cod.edu/experts to see our full lineup of activities. Thanks again. I got one more question, just want to make sure. Oh, somebody said great program, and thank you. I agree. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much to our panelists and to our viewers. Hope to see you again.